In April, Putin ordered a Russian military buildup near Ukraine's borders. In response, Zelensky urged US President Joe Biden to admit the country into NATO right away, to which the response was a resounding no. Despite the amassing of Russian troops on the entire border with Ukraine and Joe Biden's constant warnings that a war was coming, Zelensky seemed unconvinced, and instead accused the West of creating panic that was detrimental to Ukraine's economy. In the meantime, Putin was spreading propaganda on Russian state TV of the rise of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, a claim which sounds ironic considering that Zelensky is Jewish. French President Emmanuel Macron met Putin in Moscow to try to discourage the Russian leader from escalating further, to little success. As February 2022 drew near, Zelensky seems to have finally realized the seriousness of the situation. In the weeks leading up to February 24th, Joe Biden reassured Putin that Ukraine was not joining NATO, while Zelensky promised him to write neutrality into the Ukrainian constitution. In response, Putin requested Ukraine also concede that Crimea was now legally part of Russia and cede the entirety of the Donbass. Zelensky rejected the demand. On the morning of February 24, 2022, a day which will live in infamy, Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. That morning, Ukrainians woke up to screaming sirens and loud explosions just outside their windows. As mothers tightly hugged their children in fear, Russian forces advanced into Ukraine from all directions. It is said that when Zelensky's wife woke up that morning, she saw the Ukrainian president standing fully dressed and looking out the window. Zelensky then turned around and looked at her before saying, "It started." With the Ukrainian defenses taken aback, Russian forces quickly advanced into the country. Within mere days, major cities such as Melitopol, Mariupol, and Kherson were encircled by the Russians as they rapidly occupied about 18% of the country. As the Russians seemed to be steamrolling their way towards Kyiv, Turkish President Recep Erdogan called Zelensky, offering him an airlift out of the city to a safer location, to which Zelensky famously responded, "I need ammunition, not a ride." As the Ukrainian government declared general mobilization and severed diplomatic relations with Russia, the most critical battle of the war was about to take place in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Vladimir Putin expected a quick war, as he was reassured time and time again by his generals that it would take no longer than a week to take Kyiv. From then, he would annex Donbass and install a puppet government in Ukraine. Putin's assumption was about to be put to the test as Russian artillery began shelling the city. The Russians advanced so quickly they were now less than 20 miles away from the presidential palace in the center of the city. As a Russian attack on the Kyiv TV tower cut all television access across the city, the citizens of Kyiv could do little more than weep and pray. The Russian assault was ruthless, targeting civilian homes, maternity wards, and Holocaust memorials. Tens of thousands of people hid in the city's subway for shelter against the attacks. As March came around, it seemed like the city was almost fully encircled and would fall any day. But the Russians were so convinced that Ukraine would not put up much of a fight, that they were about to make a series of mistakes that would prove detrimental to the war effort. The first came in late February, when Russian helicopters and ground troops attempted to seize the strategic airbase at Hostomel airport. While they successfully managed to push the Ukrainians out of the airbase, as they were retreating, the Ukrainians blew up the runway, making it unusable for landing future Russian paratrooper reinforcements. As a result, the Russian forces would now be forced to attack in a lined-up column along the only major road linking the Belarusian border to Kyiv, making them predictable and easy targets for Ukrainian counteroffensives. Secondly, the Russians did not even bother coordinating a full-fledged aerial campaign to destroy Ukrainian command and control centers, instead focusing on launching a blitzkrieg-style attack with ground forces. Moreover, Putin underestimated Ukrainian capabilities so much that he didn't even send his most experienced forces at the Ukrainian capital, and only provided his forces enough supply to last a couple weeks. As a result, despite being outnumbered 12-1, Ukrainian defenses successfully stalled the Russian offensive at the outskirts of Kyiv. Unable to advance any further and running out of supplies, the Russians decided to lay out a siege of the city. However, in another blow to Putin, on March 22nd, a Ukrainian counteroffensive successfully surprised the supply-starved Russians and pushed them out of Kyiv's outskirts. Realizing the continued offensive would likely result in a complete demolition of the Kyiv theater, on March 29th, Putin ordered a complete withdrawal away from the city. The Battle of Kyiv was over, and it was the first major Ukrainian victory in the war. At the same time as the Battle for Kyiv was happening, in the east, the Russians were approaching on the second largest Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Within the first few days of the war, the Russians entered the city, and just like in Kyiv, everybody expected for the city to fall swiftly. For the next week, the Russians would intensify their strikes, bombing homes, cultural buildings, schools, and playgrounds. However, in a similar story as in Kyiv, the Russians greatly underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian defense, and thus sent in heavily underprepared and undersupplied troops. A critical development happened on March 30th, when the Ukrainian forces managed to reopen a highway between Kharkiv and a nearby village. As mechanized Ukrainian reinforcements rushed into the city, they stalled the Russian advance. In late April, the now reinforced Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, pushing the Russians out of the outskirts of the city. By using a combination of traditional warfare, guerrilla sabotage tactics, and surprise assaults, by mid-May, the Ukrainians pushed the invaders out of the shelling range of the capital. Putin had underestimated the Ukrainians again, and on May 13th, the Institute for the Study of War declared that Ukraine had won the Battle of Kharkiv. As battles for Ukraine's two most important cities were ongoing, Russian and Ukrainian delegations met in Istanbul to negotiate the end of the war. With Russian pressure on their major cities, Ukrainians ceded to several Russian demands, including renouncing their attempts to join NATO, declaring neutrality, recognizing Russian as an official language, reducing the size of the army, and allegedly even agreeing to lease Crimea to Russia. Ukraine refused, however, to cede the Donbass and legally recognize Crimea as Russian. However, as weeks passed and Ukraine seemed to have successfully pushed the Russians out of Kyiv and Kharkiv, the Ukrainians began rethinking the scope of their concessions. On April 7th, their delegation presented a peace draft, which Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called unacceptable. 2 days later, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited the now fully recaptured Kyiv and encouraged the Ukrainians not to concede to Putin and keep fighting for the independence and westernization of their country. 3 days later, and as Russian war crimes during their assault on Kyiv were being exposed, the Ukrainians withdrew themselves from negotiations. The war was just getting started. As the Russians declared that the negotiations had hit a dead end, Putin looked at the situation on the battlefield in disbelief. Rather than capitulating Ukraine in 3 days as expected, the Russians had lost tens of thousands of troops only to be pushed away from the most important cities in Ukraine. Moreover, their offensive in the southeast had by now come to a complete halt when the Ukrainians successfully stopped the Russian advance during the Battle of Mykolaiv. Other than Kherson, Russia failed to capture any regional capitals or truly important cities in Ukraine. Putin failed to pressure Ukraine at the negotiating table into submitting to Russian demands. And perhaps worst of all, by now, there existed a large and passionate international coalition assembled by US President Joe Biden, applying harsh sanctions on Russia while providing billions in funding and weapons for Ukraine's defense. As a result of these sanctions, the Russian ruble crashed during the first months of the war, while the Ukrainian military was being equipped with all of the latest technology. By all available metrics, Putin's special military operation was a complete disaster. He now had a choice: admit defeat or fight a war of attrition which could potentially last many years. And of course, Putin never admits defeat. As the months dragged on, the Russians advanced at a snail's speed, being forced to sacrifice thousands of soldiers at every opportunity to move forward. Throughout the summer, it was reported by many news outlets that Ukraine was preparing a counteroffensive to take back Kherson, the only regional capital Russia took during the war. The Russian position was much weaker in this area, as the city was separated from the rest of their front line by a river. Over the course of the next several months, thousands of both Ukrainian and Russian troops were being transferred to the Kherson region, as the world was eager to watch what would happen once the Ukrainians attacked. As September drew near, the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive finally started. But not in Kherson, it started in Kharkiv. The Russians, having been under the impression that the Ukrainians would attack in Kherson, were taken by complete surprise. In a single day, the Ukrainians broke through Russian front lines and advanced more than 12 miles into occupied territory. In the next 3 days, they had advanced more than 30 miles into Russian-held land. Putin ordered a complete withdrawal from Kharkiv. The Russians were never to approach Kharkiv again. The international community was taken by shock at how quickly Ukraine was able to recapture so much territory. If this wasn't already the case, the myth of the unstoppable Russian army was completely disproven. Was Ukraine really about to take back all of its land and secure its status as a Western democracy independent of Russia, once and for all? Simultaneously to the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukraine was pressuring Russia in Kherson as initially expected. Unlike Kharkiv, Russia had spent months preparing for this offensive, and at first, they were able to successfully repel the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, as the weeks progressed, the Ukrainians inched forward towards the city, exerting more and more pressure on supply-lacking Russian defenses. As September went by, Ukraine liberated Kherson village by village. By the end of the month, local Russian commanders said their positions were untenable and requested to withdraw, a request which was firmly denied by Putin. As October progressed, the Ukrainians slowly drew closer to the city, and by the end of the month, the Russians began evacuating Kherson. In early November, despite his demands for a full defense of Kherson, even Putin seemed to admit that his army was undersupplied and that their positions were simply untenable. If he did not order a withdrawal now, the army would likely get encircled along the river. Thus, on November 9th, the Russians withdrew from Kherson. 2 days later, Ukrainian troops entered the city to no Russian resistance and were met with loud cheers from the local population who exclaimed, "Slava Ukraini," or "Glory to Ukraine." The recapture of Kherson served as another reassurance to US President Joe Biden and the international community that Ukraine was ultimately going to win the war. Biden's coalition only intensified their funding, and by now, even leaders like Germany's Olaf Scholz, who were at first reluctant to support Ukraine, were fully on board to see the war through to the end. But as winter drew near, Ukraine couldn't make any further advances, and both sides spent much of the next few months entrenching themselves along the front line. Likely in response to intensifying domestic pressure on him over his failings in the war, on September 30th, Putin announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. The Russian authoritarian statements were largely disregarded by the international community, as Russia didn't even control the entirety of this land. By and large, 2022 was a major success for the Ukrainian defenses, as it now looked increasingly more likely that they would ultimately win this war. 2023, however, would turn out to be a completely different year. As spring began, Russia continued its slow offensive in the country's east. While there were many minor battles, the most important was the Battle of Bakhmut. While Bakhmut was a very small and tactically unimportant city, having been under siege by the Russians since July, it became a symbol of staunch Ukrainian resistance in Donetsk. Amid intense Russian shelling, the Ukrainians held their positions like an iron dome. the battle in the destroyed city raged for almost an entire year and grew into Europe's bloodiest battle since World War II. Nonetheless, by May, Bakhmut was completely surrounded and Ukrainian defensive positions fell under increasing risk of encirclement. On May 20th, Zelensky finally ordered a complete withdrawal from Bakhmut, giving Russians an important symbolic victory. This battle alone is estimated to have had more than 100,000 casualties. By now, you might be seeing the pattern of the war. Russia's strategy revolves around a slow, grinding offensive along the front line, with incremental but consistent gains. In the meantime, Ukraine relies on sudden and unexpected counteroffensives in particular regions, which retake back a lot of territory all at once. While as summer drew near, it was time for another much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive. In early June, Ukraine launched simultaneous attacks along 4 separate fronts. According to Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Zelensky, this was done mainly to mitigate the risk of any one particular offensive failing. After probing in all 4 directions, the Ukrainians would then identify the weakest of the 4 spots and concentrate all of their efforts there. However, with the Russians having had a year to meticulously fortify their positions, the Ukrainians faced stiff resistance in all of the 4 directions. However, as Russia was busy defending against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, they failed to realize that they might soon have to fight all the way near Moscow. It all started with a Russian man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who commanded the independent hard-right militia unit, the Wagner group, growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of coordination and support coming from the conventional Russian army. Prigozhin also felt that while his Wagner group achieved some of Russia's biggest successes in the war against Ukraine, Vladimir Putin would attribute all of the credit to the conventional forces. Moreover, with Putin now threatening to dismantle the Wagner group entirely and integrate them into the government forces, on the 23rd of June, Prigozhin's frustrations grew into resentment of the president, and Prigozhin commanded his units to leave Ukraine and march on Moscow. After making a short stop in Rostov-on-Don to capture the army base in the city and resupply his troops, Prigozhin speedily advanced towards the Russian capital. Panic was propagating the Kremlin. Putin ordered for blockades to be constructed along the Oka River and appeared ready to confront Prigozhin outside of Moscow, when Prigozhin suddenly ordered for the rebellion to stop after speaking with the Belarusian president. To this day, it is unclear why Prigozhin ordered this halt, and there are too many possibilities to cover in this video. In August, Prigozhin died in an airplane crash, which was very likely orchestrated by Putin. Nonetheless, if not for Prigozhin's sudden change of heart, it's not at all impossible that the Wagner group might have overthrown Putin, whose forces were concentrated in Ukraine. With Russia descending into chaos, Ukraine might have won the war in the summer of 2023. However, this didn't happen, and as the months dragged on, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was slowing with each day. Other than having briefly crossed the Dnipro River in October, the Ukrainians failed to achieve any meaningful results, and even Zelensky seemed to admit that the effort was a disaster. While not having a significant effect on the battlefield, Ukraine's failed counteroffensive did have serious political ramifications. In the United States, politicians in the Republican Party began questioning why they were spending billions of dollars on a war which seemed to have devolved into a complete stalemate. While President Joe Biden reassured Zelensky that the United States would support Ukraine for as long as it takes, he now faced more and more difficulty passing funding for Ukraine through the Republican-controlled House. After Ukraine's failure in the summer of 2023, it looked increasingly more unlikely that Ukraine would be able to wrestle any more of their land back from the occupiers. Russia continued its sluggish, heavy casualty assault on the Donbass, sacrificing thousands of lives for every field and village it captured and destroying everything in its way. In February, Russia achieved a symbolic victory with the fall of Avdiivka, a Ukrainian stronghold in Donetsk, which the Ukrainians have staunchly defended for many months. As 2024 progressed, the front lines seemed to have completely stabilized, with both sides deeply entrenched and minefields separating them. There was only incremental progress on the battlefield. However, little did Putin know that Ukraine was about to do something unprecedented. They were about to invade inside Russia. In August, Ukraine again attempted to take Russia by surprise by launching an offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast. Taking advantage of the lack of experience of the units stationed there, the Ukrainians were able to capture about 500 square miles of territory, more than Russia had captured in Ukraine over the last 8 months. Perhaps the most notable thing about the offensive is that it clearly broke Putin's red line of using nuclear weapons against any nation that attacks on Russian soil. Nonetheless, as Russia diverted troops from other parts of the front line, Ukraine's offensive was stalled, and after a months-long struggle, Russia would manage to force Ukraine out of Kursk. In the meantime, across the ocean, the 2024 United States presidential election was underway, with Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris pitted against Republican former President Donald Trump. While Harris supported the Biden policy of funding Ukraine for as long as it takes, Trump wanted to negotiate an end to the war as quickly as possible, citing the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost in Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. As November came, Americans lined up at the polls and voted for the next leader of the free world. The result? Trump was coming back to the White House. With the imminent return of the Republicans to power, both fear and hope decimated across Ukraine. While many everyday Ukrainians were hopeful that Trump might finally negotiate an end to the brutality in their country, others feared a complete US withdrawal from supporting Ukraine with ammunition. Over the last 3 years, the United States has become Ukraine's biggest backer and friend on the international world stage, and a US withdrawal could be catastrophic for the country's hopes on the battlefield. In the meantime, Putin and the Russians celebrated Trump's return to power as the president was viewed as friendlier to Russia when compared to the previous administration. In January 2025, President Trump entered the Oval Office and immediately got to work. While we do not know for certain all the details, from the limited information we have, Trump's plan for peace seems to be something along the following. Ukraine renounces its ability to join NATO and declares itself as a neutral state. Russia gets to keep the land it currently controls in Ukraine, and there is a demilitarized zone established between the two countries, guarded by European peacekeepers. While Trump's plan does seem like it grants Russia a lot of concessions, it crucially does not include the demilitarization of Ukraine and allows for the country to join the EU and maintain general independence over its foreign policy. While in his eyes, Trump's plan might be the most realistic pathway to peace, the president would soon find himself in a political gridlock trying to implement it. Zelensky, while agreeing to some of Trump's proposals, would never sign any agreement that even as much as risks jeopardizing Ukraine's independence. In Zelensky's eyes, too many lives had been sacrificed to agree to capitulation now. Russia hasn't made much progress on the battlefield since the early months of the war, and surely cannot keep supplying its military indefinitely. Moreover, with the experience of Minsk I and Minsk II behind them, most Ukrainians believe that any truce with Russia will be temporary, and eventually, Russia would simply reorganize and attack again. In the meanwhile, despite many setbacks and incredibly sluggish progress, Putin still sees himself as on the ascent on the battlefield in Ukraine, and believes that ultimately Ukraine will have no other choice than bend down to his maximalist demands of becoming a Russian puppet state. Additionally, Putin seems to be betting that if he just slow walks the negotiations, giving microscopic concessions here and there, while continuing his assault on the battlefield, ultimately, Trump will just get tired of trying to mediate the conflict and walk away from the war, taking Ukraine's financing with him. If I had to guess on the two biggest Ukrainian priorities in negotiations, I would say priority 1 is ensuring Ukraine never gets attacked by Russia again, perhaps they're maintaining a strong army and having Western security guarantees. And priority 2 is coming as close to the Western sphere of influence as possible. If I had to guess on the 2 biggest Russian priorities, priority 1 would be ensuring that Ukraine falls into the Russian sphere of influence, and priority 2 would be ensuring that Ukraine remains weak, so that it never tries to escape again. As you can see, Ukrainian and Russian priorities clearly contradict each other. The situation isn't simple to resolve, and it would truly require an art of the deal to bring peace after more than 11 years of war. In the coming weeks, Trump called both Putin and Zelensky as well as met with European leaders to try to get them on board for his proposal and, in his words, stop the bloodshed. In February, the seemingly worst possible scenario developed for the young European democracy: a shouting match between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office.
Beginning of the war,
you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Following which the United States withdrew military support from Ukraine. Thankfully for Ukraine, relations would be mended in the coming weeks, when Ukraine agreed to a rare minerals deal with the United States and also backed an American proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire in exchange for the resumption of American military aid. Putin believed, however, that an immediate ceasefire would deprive him of any leverage that he has over the negotiation process. As a result, during a phone call with Trump the following week, Putin rejected the ceasefire and instead proposed a limited pause on attacks on energy infrastructure from both sides. Zelensky accepted Putin's proposal. It finally looked like there was at least some progress towards a full ceasefire, but both sides would accuse each other of continuing strikes the very next day. By May 2025, it appeared that Trump was growing tired of mediating the talks with limited progress and issued a final ultimatum to both countries for an immediate ceasefire, with Ukraine legally accepting Russian ownership of Crimea and the rest of the territories presently under their control. While initially being staunchly opposed to this new proposition, Zelensky seemed to quietly shift his tone after being pressured by Trump. Putin still rejected the plan. In the middle of May, Zelensky met with the leaders of the UK, France, and Germany, and together they demanded Russia enforce the Trump-proposed 30-day ceasefire. Putin again refused, insisting that direct talks be held and conditions agreed upon before any ceasefire takes place. However, despite proposing talks which Ukraine agreed to himself, Putin refused to fly over to Turkey to meet with Zelensky in person, instead sending a mid-level delegation with limited decision-making power. Despite the meeting in Turkey not yielding many results, it was still a sign of progress, as this was the first time in more than 3 years that the Russian and Ukrainian delegations met to negotiate the end of the war. A second meeting was held the following month. Ukraine still insisted on an immediate ceasefire, but Russian negotiator Vladimir Medinsky said, "We are not here to agree to a ceasefire, but to secure Russian victory," and claimed that Russia was willing to fight for many more years, for as long as it takes, for Ukraine to agree to capitulation. And this event brings us to June 29th, the day of this video's release. Negotiations between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky are ongoing, with no definitive agreements made. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for staying on this journey with me, and I hope you now understand how nuanced the Russia-Ukraine war really is. I would like to take a few more minutes to provide a synthesis of everything we discussed. By and large, the story of Ukraine is a tragedy. A young European democracy trying to establish its own national identity while consistently being held back by its much larger, much meaner neighbor, while its supposed friends on the world stage are playing politics with its survival. While ultimately, the fault for the hundreds of thousands of deaths and destruction of millions more lives falls on Russia and President Putin. In truth, the West also has a small part in what's happening. The human suffering which is happening right now, has been decades in the making. Back during the early 1990s, if the West just welcomed Ukraine into the arms of NATO as Ukraine's President Kravchuk wanted, there wouldn't have been a war. Hell, if the West accepted Ukraine into NATO any time before the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, there wouldn't have been a war. If George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton didn't force Ukraine into signing the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine would have had nuclear weapons to this day, and there wouldn't have been a war. If Yanukovych just didn't bow to Russian pressure and sign the EU Association Agreement like the Ukrainian public demanded, there wouldn't have been a revolution, and likely wouldn't have been a war. With every single day that passes, hundreds of innocent people are being raped and murdered in Ukraine. It is truly a heart-wrenching tragedy. Moreover, despite President Trump's multiple overtures and concessions to Russia, as of the publication of this video, Putin seems determined to keep grinding the meat of his men in Ukraine, willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands, or perhaps even millions more lives, until the country capitulates to his maximalist demands. And in truth, at the end of the day, Putin hurt Russia more than he ever hurt the West. Since his invasion, Europe has united more than ever before in history, and both Sweden and Finland were brought into NATO. The West's barrage of economic sanctions since 2014 has likely crippled the Russian economy and the standard of living for the average Russian for decades. Putin is a man who loves history, but will history love him back? Well, here's my opinion. Imagine an alternative 1939. Hitler invades Poland. France and the UK don't even join the war to defend Poland. Hitler makes it about 18% into the country before his offensive is stopped. Poland counterattacks, taking back a bunch of land. He fights a 4-year-long war of attrition, making incremental gains, while losing 1 million Germans. At one point, one of his generals rebels against him and almost takes Berlin. Poland invades inside Germany, and it takes Hitler 8 months to push them out. When Britain offers Hitler a way out to save face, Hitler refuses and just keeps fighting on. How would Hitler be remembered in this alternate timeline? Well, your average person today probably wouldn't even know who he was. Among history nerds, Hitler would be remembered as a total loser, as that one guy who invaded a country a small fraction of his strength and somehow failed to win. At this point, I think this is how history will remember Putin. And Putin knows this. It makes him angry and gives him the drive to continue fighting for as long as it takes, so that at least he can be remembered for ultimately defeating Ukraine, even if it took far longer than it should have. As for Ukraine, it has found itself as the main victim of a global political contest between Russia and the United States. Its men, women, and children have been killed, raped, and suffered for the mistakes of other nations and its former presidents. And unless Trump can figure out a way to push Putin into signing a ceasefire agreement, it unfortunately looks like that suffering will not end anytime soon. Ultimately, Ukraine's story has been unpredictable since day one and took many twists and turns. Nobody knows what the future will bring, and we can only hope that the country has its opportunity for peace and justice sometime in the near future. This has been a long ride, and if you're listening to this, I want to sincerely thank you for watching. May peace be with you.